Volunteering SA&NT acknowledges that we are presenting and recording today on the lands of the Kaurna people. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of other lands on which you may be listening, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands, waters and communities of South Australia, the Northern Territory and across Australia.
In addition, I would like to acknowledge and thank volunteers who may be listening. The contributions and efforts of volunteers across this country drive the not-for-profit and community sectors. Without volunteers, many services simply would not be able to operate. And volunteers also enhance and extend an organisation's reach well beyond their normal scope. Hello everyone, I'm Lisa Barrett and I work at the rural city of Murraybridge. I work in the Commonwealth Home Support Programme as Selective Support and Development, and I'm here with my colleague today.
Hi everyone, I'm David Jacquier, Commonwealth Home Support Programme Sector Support and Development Coordinator at Volunteering SA&NT. Welcome.
Why are we here today, David?
Well, we're speaking to volunteers today, and what we're talking about is rights and responsibilities. It's a really interesting topic, and we've got quite a few things to talk about. I'd like to start with the definition of volunteering. Volunteering is time willingly given for the common good and without financial gain. So it's something to think about, keep in mind. If you haven't read that definition before, perhaps go to the Volunteering Australia website and have a look. But it's very important to know your rights and responsibilities because your actions and behaviours do have impact on your clients, on your work, and they also have legal ramifications. One of the really important things we wanted to talk about today was the fact that rights and responsibilities are linked together, and rights do have corresponding responsibilities and vice versa. And the reason we're talking about this today is because, well, you may know that there was a Royal Commission into aged care some time ago, and it had, I can't remember how many recommendations there were quite a lot. But out of that came the idea of redoing the Aged Care Act. And so there are those corresponding rights and responsibilities are going to be part of that Aged Care Act. By the way, please feel free to pause or replay this recording at any time to hear information again. And the slides that you see in the presentation will move forward automatically as we talk through the topics.
Yeah, we all know that at the centre of aged care is, of course, the elder Australian. And as we speak, as you said, David, the government are asking the public and providers for feedback on the consultation paper that they've done that is going to be, in the end, the new Aged Care Act. There'll be a new set of rights and responsibilities that will be enshrined in the Act, and there's going to be an update of principles as well. I'm sure you know that with every role that we have in our life, whether they're volunteers or paid people, there are both rights and responsibilities. And our rights are a privilege that are granted to us, and they're often written into law. And in that way, they can be defended in a court. And a responsibility is the duty and obligation we have, and we accept it when we put things into action. David, what do you think comes first? Do you think it's a right or a responsibility?
Bit of a chicken and egg question, I think, Lisa. I can't really say one or the other, but I know that they are always paired or they're certainly related to one another.
Sure. To me, rights seem more important to us as individuals. And in the capacity of a volunteer, we have got to be aware of all the responsibilities we have. And if we don't know them and we don't follow them, there can be some serious consequences. That said, all of your rights will facilitate the knowledge of how you can assure that you know and respond successfully to all the responsibilities that you carry. So what are these rights and responsibilities? Let's start with your rights as volunteer. All volunteers have the right to be fairly treated. This means that health and safety laws, equal opportunity, anti-discrimination laws, and much more apply to you as much as they apply to the workforce and to the clients. You've got the right to know that the job that you were doing. So this means you should be clear about what's expected of you, what's the scope of your role, and are you getting proper training? You should be given a copy of the volunteer policy that you'll be working under. That's your agency's policy. You should know who you're reporting to, and you should know what to do if the person you report to is not available. You also have the right, as a volunteer, to be appropriately insured by the agency you work for the work you do. What does that mean, David?
Well, at Volunteering SANT, we recommend that organisations have two kinds of insurance for the volunteers. One is public liability, which most organisations would have, and the other is volunteer personal accident insurance. And I think it's a really good idea for volunteers to check with the organisation when they come on board that the organisation does have those insurances. Now, in aged care, it's very likely that they will have those. It's be unlikely that they wouldn't, but it's worth checking still.
Yes. And volunteers really shouldn't be doing any work that has been done previously by a paid worker. And they shouldn't be expected to take on any of the duties that a paid person in the agency is doing. If any of those things happen, you have the right to complain. Most of the employers that you work with would call this a grievance procedure, but it's a complaint that if you are not happy with working conditions or the way you're being treated or your lack of training, then you have the right to complain about it. You also have the right to withdraw from your volunteering any time that you want. On the flip side of this, as we said earlier, there are responsibilities. There are things that you need to do and need to comply with to meet all the requirements of your volunteering role. And it's your responsibility to ensure that you are working for an agency and that you are happy, you're fully informed of the decision of the role that you're doing, and that you know all the practices of the agency and you agree with them. You must align yourself with all the aims and the objectives. You have a responsibility to always behave ethically, and it's up to you to make sure that you understand and you are orientated to the training programs that you're expected to undertake. Never undertake a task that isn't within your skills or experience or is outside of the role description. How do you know about your role description, David?
That's a very good question, Lisa, and it's something that we always talk about with both agencies and with volunteers. But the role description it's a critical document to have in the recruitment process and for during the process of volunteering, because it outlines, as you said, the scope of what is required or what is permissible in the role. And sometimes I think volunteers or agencies might look at the role description, sign off on the role description, and then perhaps forget about it until a performance management session or a review. But in the meantime, they don't remember or don't use that document as a focus. And I think it's a missed opportunity. If you use that document to guide right through the whole process of volunteering and coming on board, it's really important.
If someone asks you to do something that you're not clear about or you don't understand, you have the responsibility to actually make that clear and know those boundaries. And I think all of those things appear in the document that you're talking about.
Exactly. And although I don't want to wear the black hat all the time, it's that, what could possibly go wrong if if you don't know the scope or things go a little bit off track. So it's important to keep that handy and to be having those conversations with your supervisor.
Yeah, it almost seems like this document can enhance your rights because it gives you the opportunity to make your responsibilities living.
Yeah, it's kind of base camp really for rights and responsibilities.
Yeah. Agencies have normally got lots of other policies, occupational health and safety policies, practices that you might not have known before, and you are responsible for knowing them and for following them. There's a guide published at WorkSafe Australia. It's called A Guide to Work Health and Safety for a Volunteer. It's specifically for volunteers, and it's a great document to help you know your occupational health rights and responsibilities. While you're undergoing all of these things, you must remember that you keep confidential information about clients and information about your agency. You must also be aware that you have a duty of care, And this is something we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. While you have a lot of rights and responsibilities, so does the agency that you work for. And you should be aware of those too. Most employers have responsibilities that are in parallel to you. And so they're vice versa. If you have a right, they have a responsibility. If they have a responsibility, you have a right. They should really be providing you with a written role and statement, agreed hours of contribution that you are going to give, and access to all the policies and procedures that affect your work. As we talk about, you have the responsibility to follow them, but actually your agency has the responsibility to give them to you. Does this cause a conflict, David?
Yes, Lisa, I can see how that there could be a conflict there. If an organisation asks you to step out of the scope of your role and do something you're not comfortable with, or you don't feel trained or skilled enough in, then you certainly have the right and in some ways the responsibility to point that out. Again, if you've got a good role description, that's the document to go back to. But I'm wondering if you can think of an example of that, Lisa, that might sort of explain what we're talking about here.
Well, I was thinking of an example where there's a volunteer driver, and because they're a volunteer, they're driving somebody somewhere, but they call into the shop. So they stop and they go to the shops. And as a volunteer, you're not paid. Why shouldn't you stop at the shop on your way to somewhere? But as an employer of a volunteer, then you feel that it's not your role. It's got some risk management aspects, and that's where a conflict can arise of your understanding of what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing.
That's a great example. You can see the conflict there, and I can imagine thinking to exactly that to myself. On the other hand, for the provider, if I was doing a risk assessment of that, there would be things in there that could happen, perhaps down the track, that would be very undesirable. So I can see the conflict.
Yes, and that's where I think the responsibility of the agency to be really clear of the role of the volunteer is important. And it's the responsibility of the volunteer to read the documentation that they're given on their role and keep it front and center when they're doing their volunteering.
Absolutely.
I think some of these potential problems will be alleviated knowing that the agency has a responsibility to make sure you're the best volunteer for the role and to do your screening and to do your relevant checks and to carry out an interview so that the understanding is from even prior to you taking on your volunteering role.
And of course, Lisa, all of that should be in the role description, and we're sort of emphasising this, but it is really important. If you've got one, go and have a look at it now.
And if you don't have one, make sure that your agency gives you one. Another really important responsibility of the agency is that you get proper reimbursement for any pre-approved out-of-pocket expenses. Can you tell us what that actually means, David?
Lisa, I think it's when an organisation has an expectation that you will spend some of your money, you will provide the funds to get something that is part of the role and the volunteering that you're doing. For example, if you are driving a car and you have to put some petrol in and you haven't got the organisation card with you and you have to spend some of your own money, that would be something that you would expect to be reimbursed for.
And finally, the agency has the right to expect you to do a good job, to be loyal, to be confidential, to say no when you can't do the job or you're not suitable for the job, and to dismiss you if something occurs. Now, these rights are not necessarily legal rights, but they are moral rights, and they do have some legal grounding, as to much of the behaviours and the practice, and this is something we will approach later on.
Lisa, we've been talking about the general rights and responsibilities of volunteers that would apply to any service, any kind of volunteering. And there's a couple of good documents that you can go to find out some more information. One is the Volunteer Rights and Volunteer Checklist on Volunteering Australia's website. And the other is on our own website, Volunteering SA and NT, Volunteer Rights and Responsibilities.
There's another really important document that we really need to bring your attention to as volunteers, and that's the Code of Conduct. David, can you tell us more about that?
So the Code of Conduct comes from the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission, which is the national regulator of aged care services in Australia. And the Commission's purpose is to protect and enhance the safety, health, well-being and quality of life of people receiving government-funded aged care and services. So the Code sets out how aged care providers, their workers, including volunteers, are expected to behave and treat older Australians when providing care and services. And there are 8 elements to this code. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission has published an excellent fact sheet about the Code of Conduct for volunteers in aged care. And you'll see a QR code now on the screen. You can use that to access a copy of the fact sheet. You can also type Code of Conduct for Aged Care volunteers into your browser to access the fact sheet. And here are the 8 elements in the code and some examples of how they might apply in practice. The first one, act with respect for people's rights to freedom of expression, self-determination and decision-making in accordance with applicable laws and conventions. The second one is act in a way that treats people with dignity and respect and values their diversity. Third one is act with respect for the privacy of people. Number 4 is provide care, supports and services in a safe and competent manner with care and skill. The fifth one, act with integrity, honesty and transparency. The next one is promptly take steps to raise and act on concerns about matters that may impact the quality and safety of care, support and services. Number 7 is provide care, supports and services free from all forms of violence, discrimination, exploitation, neglect and abuse and sexual misconduct. And the last one is take all reasonable steps to prevent and respond to all forms of violence, discrimination, exploitation, neglect and abuse and sexual misconduct. It'd be a good idea to look at this document in your own time and work your way through it. And there's some excellent examples of expected behaviours and unacceptable behaviours. Perhaps we could take one of those 8 and have a closer look at that. Lisa, do you think any particular one is a good idea to chat about?
Well, David, I feel that the Code of Conduct gets us to look at our behaviour and think about the way that we want to be treated and then treat others in that same way. I have noticed, however, that number 6 on the Code of Conduct is about us reporting things that we see that may seem to be wrong. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point because in this case, not taking action is an example of unacceptable behaviour. So, you know, when you see something that is, say, reportable or there's an issue or it's an incident, there's a requirement that you will do something about it.
So who do we report to and what kind of things are we supposed to report as a volunteer?
Well, this leads us to another document and another system called CHSP. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And again, there's some documents that you can look at. In fact, there is a video on the Department of Health and Aged Care website that talks about CHSP, but I'll explain that in a moment.
And what does CHSP stand for?
CHSP is the Serious Incident Response Scheme. It's been in force for quite some time, and as far as CHSP is concerned, since December 22. You've probably heard about this if you're working with clients in your organisation. You should know about this. It's part of the incident management system in your organisation. You know, if you haven't had some training or some discussion at least and conversation about CHSP in your organisation, that's something you need to follow up on.
Now, I do understand from the document I've got in front of me that there are 8 incidents that are serious incidents for reporting, which will fall under the CHSP. Can you tell me what they are?
Number 1 is an unreasonable use of force. Number 2 is sexual contact or inappropriate sexual touching. Number 3, psychological or emotional abuse. Number 4, unexpected death. Number 5, stealing or financial coercion by a staff member. Number 6 is neglect. Number 7 is inappropriate use of restrictive practices. And number 8 is unexplained absence from care, a missing person.
As a volunteer, do I have to report it to anybody?
You do. These 8 things, although it's not up to you as a volunteer to decide whether these things are actually occurring. If you think they are occurring, then you need to notify someone, and that would be your supervisor or the person in your organisation who works with the incident management system, and really both if possible.
What about if you're not sure if it falls under one of those 8 categories?
If you're volunteering in aged care and see something wrong, here's what you should do. First, make sure everyone is safe and call for help if needed. Follow your service's rules for handling incidents. Tell your manager as soon as you find out about it. And help the older person know who they can talk to about the problem, like a staff member, the commission, or a group like the Older Persons Advocacy Network, OPAN.
Everything we've talked about so far is underpinned by legislation. They are the laws of the country that protect us as citizens. There are 2 different types of laws. There are state laws and there are federal laws, sometimes called Commonwealth laws. The federal laws apply to the whole of Australia. State laws only apply within the state that they're written. Like everything else, there can be a conflict. And if there's conflict between the 2, the Commonwealth law is the one that would be the applicable one for you. In the state of South Australia, there are some particular legislations of protection. There's the Volunteer Protection Act, and I want to spend a minute just talking about this because it is particularly something that can protect you as a volunteer, and it would be good for you to at least know about. It's very short, but it recognises in writing that volunteers are in a unique position and they make a massive contribution to the South Australian community. It protects volunteers from liability as long as they are acting within their scope and their experience, using their rights and responsibilities. There is only one situation where a volunteer may not be covered by their agency, and that is if somebody has made a claim that a volunteer has acted inappropriately and they make a claim against the agency and the agency decides they won't accept responsibility on behalf of a volunteer and will countersue the volunteer.
It's really interesting and it's really important to this Act because it comes back to those role descriptions and the scope that you know about your role and working within that role. It's really important to know that because the Act says if you're working in that scope that the organisation has given you, then you will be exempt from any liability. But if you go out of that scope and do something that you shouldn't do, an example of unexpected behaviour or whatever it is, then you're not covered by the Act. So it's really important to go back to that role description again.
Thank you, David. Another really good act in South Australia is the Equal Opportunities Act, because this prohibits any discrimination in employment and it also applies to volunteers, and that's on grounds of age, sex, pregnancy, race or disability, and it protects people from victimisation by their employer or sexual harassment from an employee. For the purposes of the Act, volunteers are called unpaid workers, but essentially they are the same thing. There are also a few federal pieces of legislation that can be quite important. The Sex Discrimination Act, the Racial Discrimination Act, the Disability Discrimination Act, and the Age Discrimination Act. These acts apply a positive duty onto the agency, and this should prevent the discrimination from happening in the first place. Another really important act that they have in Australia is called the Australian Human Rights Act. Inside the Act, there are a number of schedules, and there are covenants that are set down as the rights. Schedule 2 is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and inside there it says that all people have the rights of self-determination. There's no particular international covenant on the rights for older people as there is on the rights of the child. However, the statement that all people have rights of self-determination means that regardless of your individual opinion on how a person you care to wants their life to be, they maintain the authority over it as long as they have capacity. And ultimately, they get to decide what they want for themselves.
Let's explore those concepts a little more. And Lisa, please throw in your thoughts at any stage. I don't know how many of you out there have read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN. I know I hadn't before this, but it really did get me thinking about the concept of rights and the co-concept of responsibilities. And this declaration talks about the recognition of all peoples without discrimination, the rights to freedom of movement and residence within states, security, equal protection of the law, fair and public hearings, a right to a nationality, the right to marry, and with the full consent of the intending spouses. Then there are the rights to be free from slavery or servitude, torture, cruel or inhuman treatment, discrimination, arbitrary arrest or exile. And all of these are in order to promote social progress and better standards of life.
When it comes to rights for aged care, who holds the balance of power? I think as volunteers, it's very important to remember that the balance of power will always end with your client. And I think what all of these things are alluding to is that as long as you have capacity to think for yourself, no matter what anyone else thinks, you have the power to be in control of your life. I think in aged care, that's often something that is sidelined because what we think is for the benefit of someone might not be what they think. Well, thank you, David, for inviting me to come and talk about such an important topic.
Thanks, Lisa. I think we had a great conversation today. I hope people enjoyed it.
Yes, I think they would. And if on the screen now, there should be 2 QR codes. One will be a set of resources that we've talked about within the podcast, and the other one is an evaluation form. Now, the evaluation form is really important for you to fill in because it helps us to continue to provide this kind of education and seminar in the future. If you're in South Australia, feel free to contact either myself or David if you would like us to come and deliver a similar kind of content in real life.
Thanks again, Lisa, for the great conversation. We'll see you soon.